So you were always a fan, because now you're like a stand-up, you're still actively performing, but also you're a stand-up historian of sorts. You're really into the history and the roots and the origins. Was that something you always had, or did that come with being a part of it for so long?
No, I didn't become interested in history till I became history. Well, you know, when you're young, Don, you just want to get up there and be funny, and I was only concerned with how to make people laugh in front of me at that moment, right?
Right.
But as I got older, I got a real appreciation for it, and I became friends with Phyllis Diller. That made a big difference. She was a pioneer. She was the first female stand-up star.
Yeah.
In a time when there were a handful of women doing stand-up, that's all. And
Right.
And she was into the history of it, and encouraged me, really inspired me, to get into it. Yeah. So I'd read books back when I first started. When I first started, the first book I read really specifically about stand-up was The Last Laugh by Phil Berger. And it was a book, I think, first edition came out in 75 or something like that. And I first started in 77, January.
Right.
And my girl bought me that book, and I devoured it. I still have the copy on my shelf. It's a great
awesome.
book if you ever read it.
That's awesome. I just think the history of stand-up comedy, when you look at comedy as an art form and the way it's evolved through the years and ebbs and flows and how it's become where we are today, it's just an amazing ride, and it's always moving and evolving. So even today, when we see what some of these comedians are going through with the culture and how things are moving along.
Film company, not a movie studio, not a film festival, nobody will touch this film. Thank God for Ted Sarandos and Netflix. He's the only one that didn't cancel me yet.
So and I always think also one thing throughout history is comedy is very important. To me, it transcends entertainment. It gets a little deeper. It's part of our culture and who we are and how we view the world. And the truth is often said in jest in some ways. And I think coming out of like the 50s and 60s, it started to get more into that, where the comedians became truth tellers.
Yeah, I think you have a point there. It has been one long flowing river of jokes. And it's an original American art form. The first stand-up comic was an American. I could trace it back. You can find the first stand-up comic. His name is Artemus Ward. Started in the Civil War. Amazing. Every aspect you would think of a modern comic, he was. He just lived to hear that laughter. He was obsessed with it, finding new jokes, getting new laughs. He hit the road. That's when travel was really tough. So every part of it is the same, really. George Burns had this quote. He said, "The comedic soul is eternal." And so if you look at the personality of the comics, how they did comedy, the style they did, what type of jokes they told, that may change, but the personality of the comics really hasn't changed.
Yeah.
The type of person that does stand-up comedy really hasn't changed.
Yeah, that's awesome. From Artemus Ward, he kind of inspired, in a way, Mark Twain, right?
Not in a way, Mark Twain wrote an essay saying that when he started doing what we know was stand-up, it was completely him just doing what Artemus Ward did. Right. He had his deadpan style, right, where you act like you didn't even know you told a joke, and he did exactly the style of a slacker character, like a lazy character, which, because the comics who really hit the mark are the ones who reflect the times perfectly. And back then, in that time period, if you didn't work, you didn't eat. Right. There was not a question.
Man is really the most interesting jackass there is. It's his idea, you see, that the deity sits up nights to admire him.
That's always the way. If you can find the zeitgeist, and the great comics always hit the mark with the zeitgeist. I know we're going to talk about that in a minute.
Yes, indeed. So this is going to be about the top 5 comedians who ruled the 70s. And the 70s was a big decade for stand-up because it was the birth of the comedy club, really. I know they really started in the 60s with the improv. And
no, I mean, they were showcase clubs, and that wasn't, and Bud Friedman's club, which started in 1962, they were, singers and comics. Of course, comics are like cockroaches. Once we get into a place, we infest it. We sort of take over. Right. And, so he eventually that became just really mostly comics. When I got there in '79, there would be like a couple of singers a night, but it was mostly comics.
Right. Yeah.
The comedy club, as we know it, the modern comedy club, which is just stand-up comedy, which is a totally new phenomenon, right? The first clubs were in Southern California in the late '70s. There was Mitzi Shore started a club down in, it was in Pacific Beach in San Diego, and then moved to La Jolla where it still is today. So in 1976, she started that club. Then there was the Laugh Stop in Newport Beach, and then Mike Lacey's Comedy Magic Club, Hermosa Beach. They were all Southern California clubs. These are the first paying clubs. They just paid stand-ups to come in. They weren't like Rodney Dangerfield's club, right, which he opened in the 60s. So his club was singers. One week it might be a singer, one might be a comic, so it was a mix, but I mean, just comics. And then the explosion started in 1980. Just
That's
by
when
1985, there were like 500 professional stand-up comedy clubs in the U.S.
Yeah, throughout the boom. But yeah, so like you said, in the 70s was when they really, the first clubs started to open up and
Right.
become the template for what the 80s would then
Right.
then do in the boom. So also I think too in that decade, what makes the 70s so special is it seems to be when stand-up started to become cool for the younger generation and edgy and dangerous.
Newsmen always say things like, Americans were shocked today when they learned. Let's face it, nothing shocks this country anymore. They should just tell the truth. The world came to an end today. Most Americans couldn't give a shit about the whole thing. Give me a hamburger and some gasoline.